Lagarde, who was, no longer is, but was the chief executive of the International Monetary Fund. And she said, public financial management is the fine art of budgeting, spending and managing public money. It's quite a nice, simple way of defining it. And the first of my principles would be about knowing the rules. There are rules for managing public money in whatever public institution you belong to, whether that be a Ministry of Finance or a line ministry, whether that be in a local government, a hospital or whatever. It will have rules, and you should know them. I think it's a bit, there's that thing when you get an app on a smartphone where it gives you this big list of things and terms and conditions, and we don't read them, we just accept them. Well, you can't treat the rules, the financial rules of an organization you work for in that way. You do actually have to read them and understand them. But I would also go a bit further and say, once you do read and understand them, then, work with them, really. Rules are there to help and guide you. If you've got authority to spend money, I don't know where that green line came from. If you've got authority to spend money up to a certain limit, then take that authority. Don't give it away to other people. Okay. Okay. Second rule: be in control. So, what I mean is understand. Could people mute their microphones, because I'm hearing a lot of scratching and banging and things. Would you mind?
We would really appreciate if all the participants could mute their mics. And if you have any questions, please do send us in the chat boxes and leave your questions at the end of the session. So in the meantime, if you could just all mute your mics, that would be really grateful. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So, be in control. And what I mean by that is, if you've got the delegated authority to manage and spend public money, then you should take that and work with it. That still means, in my mind, that you need to seek advice from the authorised staff, the staff who are actually professionally qualified to advise you on financial matters. So I'm not saying do everything by yourself, but I am saying that if it's your budget, you need to understand your budget and be involved in making the decisions about it based on proper advice from people. That means things like the assumptions that go into a budget, you need to understand them and agree with them. Don't let accountants just use assumptions that make sense to them but are not tested with you, because they might be wrong. Accountants don't know everything. So get involved in the budgeting process. Make sure you understand and agree the assumptions. And when I used to work in public financial management directly, people would write reports for me. I was the finance director. And I really, really didn't ever want to see a decision where something would say there are no financial implications. Because I think in public service, every decision has got some financial aspect to it. Nothing can be done really without money. So if nothing else, there should be an adequate budget to pay for the thing that's being decided upon. And the decision should recognise, yes, we've got a budget to pay for this. We think it will cost us however many thousands or millions of pounds or dollars or rupiah or whatever. So there's always some financial implication. So whenever my staff would write things like this, I would cross it out and make them do it again. So everything, I think, has got financial implications. I wish I could get rid of that green line that's appeared on this screen. I don't know where it's come from. Third rule, principle. measure what matters. It requires you really to understand what goes on in your organization, in your service or institution work or whatever. So there's this regular kind of idea that we plan something, we do it, we measure and check our performance, and then we take action to fix it or improve. So this requires making some sort of measures. Now, the 80-20 rule tells us that we get 80% of the results of something from 20% of our efforts, or 20% of the products of a business actually generate 80% of the profits. You see this rule in lots of different places. 20% of the debtors we have owe us 80% of our debts. So generally, you can find a few things that you need to measure that actually tell you the whole story that you need to know. So I think you need to decide what are the useful measures for you in your service or business. That might be not tracking perhaps salary payments, which don't change very much, but tracking the things which do change from month to month. Or it might be tracking number of service users or the size of a population or whatever it is. But you need to understand your own aspect of the business and measure the things that matter and leave the rest, because you can't measure everything. However, that means you need to understand a thing called a cost structure. You need to understand how changes in activity affect your costs and your income. So sometimes a small change in the level of activity makes a big difference to the cost. If you've got lots of what are called variable costs, that they will change as you do more activity. If you've got lots of fixed costs and not much variable costs, then actually you could perhaps increase or decrease your activity quite a lot without changing your overall cost. So you need to understand that cost structure so that you know how things will change. But you also need to understand this idea of Goodhart's law, that when we use measures as a target, we get unexpected consequences. So let me give you some examples of this. There's a paradox, really, because in order to improve, we need to measure things. We need to measure how well we're doing in order to know when we're doing better. But if you say to someone, I don't know, that give them a sales target. They work in a shop, say, and you give them a sales target. You must sell 100 products a week. Well, what you might get is actually the person selling 100 products a week, just as you wanted. But you might also encourage them to do things you didn't want. So they might start offering discounts to people. That means that, yes, they're selling 100 products, but they're selling them at a lower price. That's not what you wanted. Or it might be that when they've sold 100 products in a week, they then stop selling for the rest of the week in order to save some sales for next week. So in actual fact, they're performing less well than they could. And so you get all sorts of unexpected, unintended, undesirable consequences from using measures as targets. And that means you need to understand the targets you're setting and watch the performance that's happening and be prepared really to change targets and change the system so that you don't get the unexpected and undesirable things. So that makes it, more of an art than a science, I suppose. It means that you've got to understand the people working in the system and what kind of behaviors they're adopting in order to make sure that you're getting what you want as a manager and not getting something you didn't want. Okay, so fourth principle. I think I hope this is something that's sort of expected in the Maldives as it is in Britain. So public services in Britain have to act reasonably. We have to follow the law for a start. But we also have to be reasonable in how we operate. So that is a difficult thing perhaps to define, but let me have a go and apply this to the way we manage spending money. So if you're a leader in an organization, your job is to make decisions. Okay, that's good. I used to work for when I lived and worked in London, and this is something she said to me once, and this is very much how she operated. You went into her office, you told her what the situation was, she gave you a decision almost on the spot, and then you left. So she was very decisive, and that's a good trait on the whole. But it's important that these decisions are reasonable. So in British law, and I hope these translate to you, this means that when you're considering spending public money, you need to take into account all the factors that you ought to. So you shouldn't ignore important things. So obviously things that are important might be, how much will this cost? How are we going to pay for it? Are we going to use tax income? Are we going to borrow money? And so on. What will be the impact of doing this thing in the long term? Because, for instance, if we build a school now, it doesn't just cost us money to construct it. We need to have enough money for the next 20 or 30 or 40 years to pay for the teachers and everything that will go on in that school. So you need to take into account everything that should be taken into account. But secondly, you have to not take into account things that shouldn't be taken into account. So, this means that we shouldn't take into account, for instance, the effect that something we're doing in public service here would have on election outcomes. We're not allowed to make decisions that are designed to influence an election. That's seen as, well, illegal, but unreasonable too. And it means that decision makers shouldn't be taking into account things which are just their personal interest. We're looking at building a school and they just happen to prefer to put it in one place over another. But that in itself is not a legitimate, reasonable factor to take into account. And a third principle in over here is having taken into account everything that you should and ignored all the other things that are not part of the decision, you still have to make your decision based on everything you've considered. So this principle that don't be so unreasonable that no reasonable person would do it. So this is things like, yes, we've looked at all the financial factors. We want to, we want to build 100 new schools, but we haven't got enough money. Well, you can't make a decision then, having considered that you can't afford it. It would be unreasonable then to make a decision to do it because it would bankrupt the organization. So for us, a reasonable decision, therefore, is we thought about everything that is relevant and that we should. We've ignored all the other matters, and we've based our decision on the things that we've thought about. Okay, so decisions have to be reasonable to be valid and lawful. Fifthly, understand the politics. Now, one of my favorite quotes is that the public and private sectors are alike only in unimportant ways. And I very much think that's the case, that yes, there are lots of similarities. We employ staff and we pay them salaries. It's very similar. But when you get down to it, private firms are driven by money. The point of a private firm is to take the owner's money and make more money. Now, I appreciate it doesn't always work and sometimes businesses fail, but the aim is to create more money. Well, that isn't what public sector organizations are about. Public sector organizations take money to turn that money into public services into things that the public want or need, whether that be healthcare, education, security, highways, whatever. But the money is being converted into a publicly valued thing. And so public bodies are not driven by money. They're driven by politics. And because they're driven by politics, it's obviously important that you understand the politics. And I think if you try and be an ostrich and put your head in the sand and pretend that there are no politics, that is not a successful strategy. I think if you go too far the other way, where you spend all of your time interfering and meddling and getting involved in the politics, that's probably not where you should be if you're a public servant. It's all right if you're a politician, that's what the politician is for. But if you're the public servant, the civil servant, that's not where you should be. But somewhere in between those is this place where you understand the politics, you understand that the politicians are there to represent public interest in some way, and to give a view of the public about what is important. So you need to work with that, and that means, understanding who's got power in your organization. Some people have power and some people don't. I'll come back to this idea of an authorizing environment a bit later in the 10th principle. But you need to know where you get your power from, effectively. So all the way down an organization from the very top, power is being passed down, limited, if you like, so that people lower down have less power than people higher up. But you need to understand where your power to spend public money and do good things for the public comes from. And you need to understand the sort of games that are played with budgets. Can't go into all the details now, but budgets are absolutely critically important to public bodies. More important, I think, than in private businesses. If you want something to be done by a public body, you need to get it in the budget. That means that the budget process takes a long time. There are lots of discussions and perhaps even arguments and so on. And as I say, sometimes there are games played. People doing deals, put this in the budget and I'll let you put something else in the budget. Or maybe people are overstating what they want. A bit like if you wanted a 10% pay rise, you might ask for a 20% pay rise and see if maybe you got 10. So that might be going on. Or there might be people who are exaggerating the effect of not having something in the budget. If we don't get this money, people will die. Something like that. So you have to understand what's going on in your organization. I'm not necessarily encouraging you to play these games, but certainly to understand them and understand how the budget is formed, because the budget will be a political activity, and as I say, fundamentally a part of the way public bodies do things in a way that it isn't in businesses. Okay. Number 6, be a good partner. Maybe at times in the past, public bodies have they've employed all the staff they need to do the things that they do and stay completely in control. But the recent, I suppose, 30 years, maybe it is, maybe longer, the kind of growing idea about public services around the world is that governments and public bodies are commission services that they don't necessarily deliver themselves. So they get involved with other organizations. They may be commercial organizations, they may be NGOs, they may be that one local government works with another local government, or maybe different tiers of government work together. Lots of ways in which public services these days work in partnership with each other. But if you're going to do things through partnership, there are a number of issues that come from it. One is you might still be completely accountable for what is delivered, and yet you're not responsible for it in a day-to-day way anymore. So it's more comfortable, I think, to be the person who's accountable and on the hook for something if all the staff work for you directly, because if nothing else, you can get your staff together, have meetings, tell people you need to do this, do that. This is how we need to fix things. If you do stuff through partners, that becomes much more difficult. Your partner is employing their staff and you somehow need to persuade them that they need to do something different. Maybe you have to use a contract or a grant mechanism to do it. It becomes much more difficult, and yet you might still be the person ultimately who's accountable for the outcome, the result. So that's a factor to bear in mind. But also, as I say, you need to learn how to be a good partner, and good partners are not, I don't think, necessarily always going to agree with each other, but they need to have a way that they can work together, like husband and wife, maybe, that they're supporting each other. And when they've got differences of opinion, they can have a proper forum that can share those differences of opinion. When one partner lets down the other partner, they have some way of trying to correct for that. I don't have time right now to talk at length about the prisoner's dilemma. So I'll leave you to kind of look this up afterwards if you've never heard of it. But the prisoner's dilemma was developed in the 1940s and 50s as really as a way of trying to explain how the Cold War worked. So effectively, the Cold War, Russia and America are looking at each other, and they each knew that if they let their nuclear weapons, fired their nuclear weapons at the other, that the result of that would be their own self-destruction. So they were kind of caught in this sort of standoff. And the prisoner's dilemma was a game, I suppose, to try and work out tactics. But one of the things that comes from the prisoner's dilemma is that rather than mutually assured destruction, and that's not what you want when you're looking at a partnership. You don't want to get to the place where my partner has now let me down. I'm now going to, in the husband and wife analogy, I'm now going to sue for divorce. And before you know it, there's just a terrible mess. The partnership has ended. There's people paying lots of money to lawyers. There's problems in service delivery, and the public are being affected in negative ways because things they were relying on aren't happening and so on. So that kind of, if you like, the nuclear option isn't really available. And one of the things that the prisoner's dilemma can show is that if the two partners, let's just keep it at two partners for now. If two partners are kind of working along well, they should keep working along. And when one lets down the other, the second should then take some action to correct it, but then they should go back to working together. A bit like with your children, you love your children, you work with them, and then at some point your children do something you don't like, maybe a small thing, and you in quotes punish them. Maybe you ground them for a while or something, but you don't stop loving them. After they've been grounded, you go back to normal. And actually, there's something to be said for the way partnerships in public service should work. That when someone does something wrong, it shouldn't be ignored, but nor should it just immediately go to this nuclear option of, okay, let's throw the whole thing away. I think you have to look at it much more as a family. Okay, 7. Sticking with the idea of um, partners. Something that I think is very true in Britain. I'd be interested to know if this is the case in the Maldives. In Britain, my training, as well as being trained as an accountant, my management training was all about how to hire staff to do, to do recruitment interviews that were fair and open, how to motivate staff, the different techniques you can use, how to discipline staff who've done something wrong. Everything was all about managing staff. And when I started in the 1980s in local government, probably 70, 80% of all the money we spent was spent on salaries. So it sort of made sense. That was really what we did. Modern times, direct employees are perhaps half that. And 30, 40, maybe 50% is staff. And now a much bigger portion is payments that are made to suppliers of some sort or another through some sort of contract. But I never had any training in how to procure suppliers. I never had any training in how to manage a contract. I didn't have any training in how to get out of a contract or to take action against a contractor who was in some way underperforming. No, I have no official training in any of those things. Negotiation skills. I've learned all those things because my job meant I needed to, and I've been involved in procurement for 30 years and know a lot about how to get into contracts, and I've also had to fire contractors and get out of contracts. So I've learned, but not through any formal training. And you can still see it in UK public services that we have personnel or human resource departments that are very big. They might be 20, 30, 40, 50 people in a human resource department to manage hiring people and paying their salaries and so on. And there'll be maybe fewer than 10 who work in procurement, even though we spend as much money now on things we buy through procurement as we do on salaries. So in Britain, there's a definite lack of proper training in managing procurements and managing contracts. So I think, though, if you're going to manage public money, unless you only have salaried employees, which seems unlikely these days, then you need to understand contracts and be commercial, understand how the private sector is looking at a contract, which is probably quite different from you. So a contract is an exchange of promises. Basically, they promise to deliver some services or goods to you, and you promise to pay them the price that's agreed. Basically, that's a contract. But it's also an allocation of risk, and this is something that's perhaps not always understood. And you, as a public servant, want to make sure that you're allocating risks in a fair way. So you don't want to be in a situation where suppliers aren't taking their fair share of risk. So your contracts, as you write them down, need to make clear what are the risks that partner has to bear. So one of the ways we do this, I haven't got time to go into detail here, but one of the ways we do this is we use fixed price contracts for things. So stick with my let's build a school example. When we get our tenders in from contractors to build the school, we will ask for a fixed price. That means it's the contractor's risk to do everything that's needed from the foundations and the construction work and managing all their staff and dealing with the weather and anything that's involved in this construction to build the school buildings to the right quality on time, and they're only going to get paid the price that's agreed. They can't come along later and say, well, the ground was harder than we thought and we need more money, or we forgot to include money for the electricity distribution around the school. So here's our bill for all the electrical work. None of that happens because the risk was there. They had the risk of getting the price right in the first place. So that's one example of how you allocate risks in contracts. And lastly, although technically in Britain, contracts don't have to be written down, it's in everybody's interest that these agreements are written down so that everyone can refer to them and agree. And Gary's basic rules of thumb for outsourcing, for when to use a contractor and when not to use a contractor, I would say never use a contractor for anything that's strategically important to you. So that means something different in every organization, really. But let me use an example of Apple. I'm talking to you through an Apple computer, so it's on my mind. Apple are perfectly happy to use contractors in China and elsewhere to build their phones and computers and so on. But they don't let any retailers sell their products. They sell their products through their website, their own stores, and a very small number of licensed stores, because the whole customer experience is so strategically important to Apple that they won't just let anybody do it. Okay. They design all their products because that's important to them. And same applies, I think, in public services. There will be some parts of your activity where you think, well, actually, I don't want a private sector person doing this. If you're the head teacher of a school, I suspect you probably want the teaching in your school to be done by people who work for you. But things which are not strategically important, like cleaning your school, well, maybe you're quite happy to use a company to provide cleaners and do a cleaning service. So it's for each organization to decide what's strategically important to them. But I would always do the strategically important stuff myself. Second, use performance contracts rather than compliance contracts. Basically, what I'm saying is tell your contractor what they have to give you in terms of results, outcomes, outputs, not what inputs they have to use. If you give someone a contract saying, we want you to keep with the cleaning thing. If you say the contract to clean this school is you have to give us 5 cleaners for 3 hours a day to clean this school, then as long as 5 people turn up with cleaning equipment and work for 3 hours, the contractor has to be paid, even if the cleaning work is badly done, because they complied with what you asked. So a cleaning contract has to work at the other end and say, maybe use photographs or something and say, this is what clean looks like. And every day you have to come in and return the school to look like this. So however dirty it is, you have to make it back to this level of clean. And then it's up to the supplier, the contractor, to figure out how many cleaners they need. And maybe that's 6, or maybe it's 4, but it doesn't matter to you because you're paying them only if they make the school clean. And if the school's not clean, you don't pay them. So you need to use performance contracts which describe the results, not that describe the inputs. And then the last one about allocation of risk is, think about it. Make sure that everything you want them to take as a risk is written down clearly so that they can't argue later. Okay, I'm taking a bit too long, so let me skip through the last 3 a bit quicker. Number 8, if you work in the public service, then I think you've got to accept that you're going to be accountable. And I think if you don't like being accountable, then you shouldn't work in the public sector. It may well be a terrible headache and annoying and an overhead, and you really wish you didn't have to keep answering these questions from the public or the media or whatever, but it comes with the territory. And if you're going to spend public money, the public have an interest in why you made the decisions that you did. I mean, sometimes you make a decision that turns out wrong. The things happen in the world that you didn't foresee. well, okay, that does sort of happen, but you still need to explain why you made the decision that you did, and accept that level of scrutiny. Ninth principle, always do the right thing. So I think certainly for me, and I think for other people, you have to live with yourself and your own conscience. And so it's easier to live with yourself and your conscience if you do the right thing. And that means, and certainly in Britain, we have a whole set of whistleblowing arrangements and so on to allow people in public bodies to report problems and concerns. So this isn't just about fraud and corruption, although it particularly relates to that. It could be other things that people are concerned about in terms of, maybe extravagance or waste, public bodies doing things, that are more luxurious than the public really expect, which is not technically a fraud. It's not technically against the law to travel business class, but might be seen as inappropriate. So the sorts of things that are being reported might not be fraud and corruption, but nonetheless, it's important to do that, and it's been something I've done at several points. One of the aspects of being the finance director in a public body in Britain is you become the person that other people tell. So people would tell me stuff about the politicians or other senior managers, and then it was my job. It was my job to go and talk to them about it and straighten it out, and ask the politicians who hadn't paid their own taxes to pay their taxes or else. So I've been both sides of it. I've been the person doing the reporting. I've been the person who's received the reports and had to act on them. But I think it's an important part about public money, that it's spent properly. And lastly, number 10 of Gary's 10 principles for managing public money is about value for money. It's about creating value for money. I said before that private companies judge their success to some extent, I think, really, in how much money they make, as profits or increasing shareholder value or something. And an academic at Harvard created a theory of public value that tries to explain what goes on in public services in some ways as a substitute for that, because we haven't got shareholder value. But the reason for using public money to create healthcare, education, transport, or whatever, is because those are things that the public want, but they want them in a value for money way. They will always demand, I think, more than you can afford to give them. But if you're going to spend public money, then they don't want it wasted. They want to get good value for money. So this academic at Harvard came up with this idea of a triangle, where he said for public managers, what they had to do was balance these three things at all times. They have to balance what the public value, because that's what they have to deliver, with their operational capacity, which is the money and the staff and the partners that they have, and the authorizing environment, the politicians, what politicians would accept or want to do. So a public manager's job is a tricky balancing act of these three things. And in my book, I kind of borrowed that idea and tried to kind of apply it to public money and create a thing called a budget triangle, where the things which the public value, whatever they are, education, healthcare, whatever, that's what public money is spent on. It's the expenditure, it's the investments that are made. And the operational capacity is replaced really by income and borrowing. So public bodies often don't have enough income in a year necessarily to pay for everything that they're spending, so they might borrow. But nonetheless, this is where your resources come from. And the political aspect is captured in the whole development budget approval process. So when it comes to spending public money, public managers have got this other triangle to try and balance, how much you're spending and what you're spending it on, where that money is coming from, and having some sort of political approval through a budget for it. And that ultimately leads to, before you spend any public money, to asking yourself these three questions, and you need a yes to all of these. So is it within the rules? Am I proposing to spend money on something I'm allowed to spend money on? Hopefully the answer to that is yes. Secondly, can we afford it? So how much will this cost me? Do I have enough money in the budget? Do we have the resources to pay for this? And thirdly, is it value for money? Value for money is not the same as being affordable. I don't know. A Mercedes car might be really good value for money, but I can't afford one. So I can only get value for money from what I can afford. So I might have to choose a car that is not a Mercedes, a Volkswagen or something, because I can afford it, but I still need to choose the best value for money car in my affordability bracket. What I can afford. And you can translate that domestic notion to public services as well. Well, we need to deliver education to this number of children. How much can we afford will govern to some extent how you set up, how many pupils might be in a class, how many teachers there are as opposed to teaching assistants, and so on, as you try to get the best value from the money you've got. And in that example, we're starting to see, because of coronavirus has led us all to kind of go online and things like that, as we start to maybe explore, well, in remote places, maybe online schooling might be better value for money. Maybe, don't know the answer to that. But those are the sorts of questions public managers should be asking of themselves as they try to answer these three questions. Is it in the rules? Can we afford it? And is it value for money? So that was my 10 principles for managing public money.